is a place that belongs to all of us, a place with a beauty all its own, a place graced by the presence of trailblazers, from Winston Churchill to the Dalai Lama, Audrey Hepburn to Masai Ujiri and the Toronto Raptors. Visionaries, leaders, artists, storytellers, athletes. Those who come here with purpose, with lifetimes packed full of experience and unique perspectives. Not all were in the history books. Not everyone a household name, but every voice important. This is a place that has the power to connect us all, a place that leaves us inspired, stirred, and most importantly, thinking differently. It's the go-to place for conversations that matter. And while this place has no fixed address, it is here, on this stage, at this podium, that our most valuable national resource lives: open dialogue. Join us here as we share the ideas that drive this nation forward. Join us in this place. Welcome to the club, the Empire Club of Canada.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the first public event hosted by the Empire Club Foundation. My name is Gordon McIver. I'm a proud past president of the Empire Club of Canada and the president of the foundation. Our foundation was set up over 50 years ago in 1969 to expand the reach of the club into the realm of academia and policy research, offering one of the largest repositories of original source material in the country through more than 4,000 speeches that have been delivered at this podium since we commenced operations back in 1903. Last month, we launched a new state-of-the-art website with AI features, a chatbot, instantaneous translation, and a robust search engine allowing researchers to easily access this important historical resource. Next month, we will unveil a Heritage Toronto plaque along with Toronto Mayor Olivia Chow to mark the birthplace of the Empire Club as an important component of the history of Canada. Many other foundation projects are currently underway or in the planning stages, and we invite you all to visit our new website for details of these various initiatives at empireclubfoundation.org. Today, as part of our historical mandate, we are thrilled to bring you a Remembrance Day themed event that is as timely as it is important: Canada and War, changing experiences and attitudes, wars past, present, and to come. Now, as many of you will know, we are streaming this live on National Indigenous Veterans Day, observed on November the 8th. The beaded poppy that I'm wearing today was made to bring honor and recognition to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis soldiers who served in the two World Wars and the Korean War, and to the many more who are serving to this day in the Canadian Armed Forces. We acknowledge today that this event is originating on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee peoples, as well as the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. We also recognize Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. We honor the enduring presence and deep concerns that Indigenous peoples have to this land and acknowledge the history that has brought us together here today. We commit to ongoing learning and reflection on our role in working toward reconciliation and fostering a more inclusive and respectful community. Now, unlike our colleagues at the Empire Club, our events at the Foundation are not financed by sponsorships, but rather through donations. And today's event is made possible through a very generous donation from the Canada Company and its leader, Mr. Blake Goldring. Mr. Goldring is a recipient of the Meritorious Service Medal from the Governor-General for his work and support of our military services, and is a member of the Order of Ontario and a member of the Order of Canada, much of which is a reflection of his lifelong service to those who serve in our armed forces, their families, and the families of the fallen. A very special thanks to Mr. Goldring and to the Canada Company for being a donor to this inaugural event. Now, before I pass the gavel to our moderator for today's event, let me underline for you how important a theme war has been in the more than 120 years of the Empire Club history. Many of our club's most famous guest speakers have spoken extensively on this topic, reporting on news from various war fronts, but reflecting on what that news meant for Canada and for the world. As we'll see today, attitudes toward war and its inevitable fallout into the history of nations has evolved substantially over the past century. And to make this point, we could quote many of our speakers, from Winston Churchill to His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales. It's important to remind ourselves here, however, that while many of the war-related speeches delivered at the Empire Club contain information and geopolitical dynamics that are as real in 2024 as they were when the speech was originally delivered. An excellent example occurred, in fact, in the year of my birth, 1954, when the first Secretary-General of the United Nations, Dag Hammarskjöld, told the Empire Club audience that one of his biggest preoccupations in the world was what he referred to as, quote, the dangerous problem in Palestine. The warning was real, and as we all know only too well, remains one of the biggest issues facing us today, exactly 70 years later. And he said words that, in fact, could have been written last fall, just prior to the horrendous events of October 7th. And here's a quote from that speech, which, again, is timeless. Quote, the problem is still far from any solution, and the danger of a breakdown in the armistice continues to be a cause for concern to the member governments in the Security Council and to me as Secretary General. So, not everything changes, and we have a certain consistency in the historical conflicts that have troubled the world over our lifetime. But to come back to today's topic, the attitudes to these conflicts and to the notion of war in general seems to have followed a very different trajectory, causing new and often unexpected attitudes to emerge. That is what we want to zoom in on today. To help us explore this topic, we have secured as the moderator of this distinguished panel a well-known author and broadcaster, Mr. Gilbert Reid, who keeps himself closely aligned with what we could call societal direction. That being how and why we come to have the beliefs that guide our actions and indeed our lives. Gilbert's command of current events is second to none, but his knowledge of history and socioeconomic movements is what really separates him from the crowd. He will keep us on topic and on time today. So Gilbert, a real pleasure to welcome you back to the podium of the Empire Club of Canada and to the Empire Club Foundation. Welcome.
Gordon, thank you. I'm intimidated. Well, it was too generous, actually. And I'm intimidated by our panel, so I'll introduce them briefly, and then we will plunge in. Gertrude Kearns is a war artist, and Gertrude, you span two worlds, the world of the military and of war and of conflict, and the world of art and artists and galleries. It's not easy, an easy thing to do, to span to straddle those two worlds, I think. And you don't pull your punches, though you're a great admirer of the military. Some of your paintings of commanders and of soldiers in action who have seen action, and they've all seen action, are incredibly moving and etched. You see in those faces the emotions of and the experience of so many of the officers you have portrayed. And you not only don't pull your punches, but you have been in and close to the action yourself as an embedded artist in Afghanistan. And you've become very close to many of the commanders and officers and soldiers that you have portrayed. And you don't pull your punches in showing also the ethical conundrums and conflicts that are involved in conflict. So it will be interesting to explore some of your work and your attitudes. General Oberwarth, you scare me even more than Gertrude does because you've seen command, you've seen action, you've been on reconnaissance, you've been in conflict, you've been in wars, you've been in peacekeeping operations in Africa, in the ex-Yugoslavia, in Afghanistan, and elsewhere in multiple roles, from the cutting edge of the front line to the lofty spheres of planning and strategy and staff work, all of which make an incredible combination of experience and visceral life in what it is to be a soldier today, and exciting and intimidating, as I said. Jonathan F. Vance is one of Canada's leading historians who's explored the history of our military, the history of attitudes to the military, how memory is incarnated in monuments, in films, in books, and in works of art, how attitudes to war and to the military have changed. And he has written a splendid, extraordinary history of Canadian culture, the way we have changed over the decades that this country has existed. So before I plunge in with you chaps who know much more than I do, I just make a quick remark, I think. We Canadians think we are very peaceful people, and in the post-war, post-World War II period, we've learned that we are very peaceful, and we've forgotten about war to a certain extent, though we have been involved in wars. But this country was actually born and structured through war, through the French, British, Indian wars, of the native wars of the 17th and 18th centuries, the American Revolution, which sent a lot of people north, including natives, to what would become Canada, the War of 1812, the American Civil War, which forced us to bang our heads together and become a nation, and then the two great world wars and the other wars that followed them. So this country has been forged in and structured by and created to a certain extent by war. So that's the past. But as William Faulkner, the American writer, said, the past is not really dead. It's not even past. General Oberwarth, you've been in wars and in peacekeeping operations. Can you give me a brief sketch of the experience of being in wars, real conflict operations, and also peacekeeping, which is perhaps even more delicate in some ways than actual conflict?
Yeah, so thank you so much for having me with you today. It's a real pleasure to be here so close to Remembrance Day. So thank you, and thank you to the rest of the panel. What I'd like to be able to do is start by saying that what I can share with you are my own experiences in both peace support operations and in conflict. We did fight a global war on terror, the conflict in Afghanistan, but certainly might not be reflective of the war experience of people, say, during World War II or World War I. So I just want to be able to get that out. As well, my experiences are my experiences. I can't speak for every soldier that's gone through what I've gone through. I can't speak for them for what they've experienced themselves, but I will share with you what I have. I'll start with peace support operations and maybe even domestic operations. And my first peace support operation or domestic operation was in 1999. We were called out to respond to the Swiss Air 111 crash, and possibly one of the most poignant things about peace support operations was said to us at that time by my company commander, who said, "Company, this is not a job for soldiers, but this is a job only soldiers can do." And this is certainly something that I hoisted aboard at that time. And then, following that, with deployments in Bosnia and Ethiopia and Eritrea, as well as in Congo, it's always something that stuck with me, that there are things that soldiers are trained to do, which is fight and win our nation's wars. But oftentimes we're called to do things that go beyond that. And as you mentioned, Gilbert, something more, peace support operations, frankly, in some ways are less dangerous, but more subtle and more nuanced, and thusly sometimes more difficult. For combat operations, this is an entirely different story. And I will tell you, my experiences in combat operations would suggest that it's very exciting. We train extensively to be able to deploy. And I mean, my father was a soldier for 35 years and never fired a shot in anger, and lived during the Cold War. In my experiences, I had trained before going into Afghanistan on my second mission, where we were really fighting quite a lot. I'd been in the military about 13 years at that point, and we as soldiers, frankly, were excited to get into action. But the interesting dichotomy here is, as much as we were excited to get into it, as soon as it started, we were using everything at our disposal to make it stop. Because it's fun to get fun to get shot at and missed, as Winston Churchill once said. But of course, that wears thin very quickly. And then what we were doing is using all of our tactical and technical expertise to win whatever battle we were in to make the fighting stop. So I think that's a viable opening, and I'll leave it there.
I was just going to say, in some of the territory, particularly around Kandahar, the Panjwai area was very difficult for Canadians, I think. The difficult terrain to fight in.
Indeed, and yes, and so that was where certainly my second deployment to Afghanistan, we fought up and down the Panj, throughout the Panjway, up along the Arghandab River, and that's certainly where my company was deployed. My combat team was deployed for those months.
It's not an easy life, but it's an exciting one.
It certainly is, and I will tell you that the interesting part about it is that every soldier in the Canadian Army is a volunteer, which makes it entirely different than what we're experiencing in some places around the world right now. So the soldiers we bring in are dedicated to duty and to service. They want to serve. They want to do the difficult jobs. They want to get their hands dirty. And they bring with them all aspects of what it's like to be a Canadian. You know, we're talking about history today. We bring that history with us wherever we go. And there's one thing that is immutable about a Canadian soldier is just that fact. He and she is Canadian. The Canadian Armed Forces, the C is the most important part. We are Canadian, and we represent our values, we represent our country, and we bring that with us wherever we go. And that is what's kept me in the military this long. I enjoy being around Canadians. I enjoy doing difficult things with Canadian soldiers that others would rather not do. But we're volunteers, and I like to believe that in my experiences, we've always held out very well and shown ourselves to be professionals in this domain.
Gertrude bridges the worlds of the civilians and the artists and the cultural people and the military. Gertrude, how did you get into this, and why did you get into this? Because it's not a natural fit in the present zeitgeist, in the zeitgeist of the last number of decades for an artist to be a war artist. It was and is a glorious tradition, but it's not an easy work. Those are not two easy worlds to straddle, art and the military. Why did you get into it, and how do you live it?
I got into it in 1990 with the Gulf Crisis because I'd had a latent interest in knowing about Canadian defense. And I made the big shift from doing bodies of large abstract work to deciding I would just put whatever talents I had at hand into focusing on Canadian Forces material as a way to get into learning about national defense. I'll just mention briefly, my father, who was 21 years older than my mother, was a World War I veteran and fought with the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And my dad passed away in 1990. So that was certainly on the back burner of my psyche, I'm sure. It's been a circuitous route the last 31 years, actually 34 years, dealing with conflict. But I'd say that more specifically, the last 30 years from 1994, when I was fascinated by General Delair's conundrum in Rwanda and the extenuating circumstances. And even up to this day, what I find with any military project is that you learn more stuff as time goes by. It's like it's never dead. It's like history. So from looking at Rwanda and General Delair, and then that was all researched because he was so deluged, so psychologically bereft and unstable, as he'd be the first to admit. It was all research, but it was General Mackenzie who I met at my Delair show, my 2-year project on Delair, which was in downtown Toronto in 2002. And General Mackenzie came to the show, and I started to research him a little bit, and I thought, these are two very different generals. who've dealt with UN missions quite differently. So he agreed to start some sittings, and I had 10 short sittings with him of about 2 hours each. Usually sittings are about 3 hours, but some works developed, and through that, his generous emphasis of the importance of leadership. And I'd say that the creation of the war print I did of him, which was a large portrait with the text, "Keep the peace or I'll kill you."
Yes, that was one of your nice conceptual pieces.
I mean, it is conceptual. I mean, Mackenzie actually said those words when he was looking at the huge painting I had done, which is in the War Museum collection. He said, "It's saying, keep the peace or I'll kill you." And then he continued with this conversation. And when he left, I was thunderstruck. I thought, this is what he said. What I recognized was, first of all, the oxymoron potential, but also the mission concept aspect of that text. So between Delair on one hand and Mackenzie, it started 30 years of very presumptuously trying to consider what all these fine professionals do. I mean, there's I've worked with some commanders who there are negative things out there about them now, but I would still vouch for the professionalism of all of them in many respects. Maybe
Let's look at two of the works now.
Sorry?
Let's look at two of the works now.
All right.
What you're doing with those works.
So are you looking? Oh, here we go. This is a 7 by 5 foot painting of General Delair, which I did in 2002. Delair number 6, with his hands over his face, painted on camouflage. I had the incredible opportunity to be at West Point just a month ago as part of a symposium on genocide when Delair he donated his papers to West Point. So this is a poster I created based on the painting. So it's a new piece, just with the title of the showing from over 20 years ago, Undone. Un being, you know, him being psychologically undone, represents the UN, how maybe things might have played out, but how things did play out. So like a multi-tiered pun on the word undone. Yes, that was number 6 in 6 large camouflage portraits showing him at different stages, from gung-ho with mission zeal to, you know, absolute, you know, facing the reality of a mission that had not gone according to any plan. Not that there really was a plan, I suppose, but.
Let's look at the other one now.
Now this is the one, yes, this is a new, a 4-year portrait of General Kinan. It's another large piece, just to give the audience a sense of scale. It's about 5 feet by 4 feet in the War Museum collection. What was really marvelous about working with General Kinan is that I'd done a first portrait of her, sort of a 3/4 figure, you know, with all her kit, pre her deployment to Baghdad to command NATO mission Iraq. And so that was all from long life sittings, but during the sittings, I took some headshots. And while she was in Baghdad, we had, I was very fortunate to have an awful lot of communication with her about how the mission was playing out. And so I was able to paint this, not only hearing stuff in the news, but actually hearing from her, you know, how she was having to revisualize the mission, reconceptualize it due to certain challenges. So I hope the painting has got a psychological punch, that it is like with so many of our generals, some of our military people have a very educated, comprehensive ability to look at things, to handle things in time. So this painting, again, is a more recent one, and I think it's nice to juxtapose it with the Delair piece. So we
That's
have like
great.
20
Thank
years.
you. Sorry, I interrupted. The bridge between culture and war is one of the subjects, and memory is one of the subjects that Jonathan Vance covers, of course, and has covered in many ways, in many aspects. And one of the dreamy moments in world history is 1914, the summer where everybody said it was the most beautiful summer anybody remembered, which maybe was projecting back an idea. And then on the 28th of June, a 19-year-old man fired 2 shots and killed the Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, in Bosnia. Things happen in particular places quite often, it seems. Those 2 shots led to the First World War. Canada was a country of 8 million people, boisterous young country as a nation at that point. And with those 2 shots and the First World War, the great Pax Britannica, the 100 years of relative world peace, and the world system of the 19th century came to an end. Jonathan, can you take us to that summer and to the impact on Canada and Canadian attitudes of the war and the experience of the war, which was exceptional, an exceptional shock for the time and forever, I would say. To you, Jonathan, I think you're muted.
My apologies. This was the golden summer of 1914. And as you say, it probably looked golden in comparison to what came later. But it was still regarded as kind of halcyon time. Not a time when Canadians typically were focusing on international affairs, particularly not in the Balkans, which for a couple of years beforehand had been unstable. There was always something odd going on there. People referred to it as the Balkan powder keg, assuming it could go off at any point in time. But there had been stirrings there before, so the assassinations were not particularly worrisome, I don't think. Anyways, people were on summer vacation. The weather was glorious. There were lots of other things to do. And what's particularly interesting is how long it takes the possibility for war to actually dawn on the Canadian people. If you follow the newspaper coverage through July, it's international events. Takes them a long time to get to the front pages. There's a lot of other stuff going on. And so no one has any particular reason to believe that this assassination will be any more damaging to world peace than anything else that had gone on in the Balkans in the previous 3 or 4 years. And it's over that weekend, first weekend of August 1914, that events move remarkably quickly from the golden summer to war. And the other interesting thing we have to remember is that it was a holiday weekend. Most of the Canadian government was out of Ottawa, at the cottage or at the golf club or whatever. People don't want to read international news on the holiday weekend, and they weren't. And then they come back on to their workplaces, to their schools, to their towns, to their cities on the 4th of August, the Tuesday, and their world is at war. So it does come as a bolt from the blue, and they have to process it very quickly. And they process it almost reflexively as something that the British Empire has to do. And because Britain has to do it, we have to do it. And so the level of enthusiasm, excitement, is matched only by the level of misapprehension about the war, what the war could actually involve. Everyone is assuming it's going to be a short war. Over by Christmas is the terminology. And so if you look at accounts from that first week or so, the one word that you see repeated most often is not catastrophe or disaster or chaos. It's opportunity. They see this war as an opportunity personally for themselves to do something great, to be involved in big things, but an opportunity for the country to step onto the world stage and play the role that it was meant to play. And of course, as we know, it's only a few months' time before it's made clear that this is not going to be a short war. It's not going to be over by Christmas. It's going to be long and painful and destructive. But by that time, Canada's fully into it, and there's really no going back from that stage. And the rest of the war, broadly speaking, is a kind of effort on the part of the nation to come to terms with that responsibility. We're in this. What do we have to do to see it through till the end? And all things considered, for a country this was our first great overseas mission, we saw things through to the end quite capably, and with great skill and with great honor.
The Canadian Corps had a rather remarkable reputation towards the end of the war, so they were considered one of the most effective forces, I believe, on the Western Front.
Exactly. They had superior leadership right from 1915, when the first divisions went over. We were fortunate to have Field Marshal Byng as a corps commander, and eventually Currie, who were really managers rather than generals. They understood organization, they understood logistics, they understood all those unsexy details that never make it in the papers, but are really essential to success on the battlefield. And because they managed the backstory of the Canadian Corps so effectively, the soldiers at the front were almost always well supported, well fed, well armed, well trained, and could do the best. And yes, you're right. By the end of the war, the Canadian Corps was probably the leading formation on the Allied side in terms of its success in action. After Vimy Ridge in April 1917, the Canadian Corps never lost another major set-piece battle. So it proved itself mid-war and was there at the finish.
The first moment when Canadians saw action, as it were, in 1915 was quite a dramatic one, and I think a huge shock for the nation. The Canadians, along with Algerian colonial troops who were next to them just outside Ypres, were subjected, I believe, to the first use of chlorine poison gas, the first use of poison gas invented by Fritz Haber, who won the Nobel Prize for something else. That must have been a huge shock to the Canadians. They lost something like 2,000 people in a weekend, which then seemed huge. Later, it was dwarfed by other figures, of course.
Yeah, it was a tremendous shock. I mean, the consensus now is that if the first Canadian Division had been better trained, they would have realized that they were in an impossible position and retreated. If they'd been less trained, they would have collapsed in the face of enemy fire. So they just had that right level of training and that right level of stubbornness that they were simply not going to give up their ground, no matter who was trying to take it from them. And in a very real sense, they probably literally saved the rest of Belgium from falling to German occupation. But it was the image of this one Canadian division standing the line in around Ypres, and a division that was largely untested in battle. And that's our first big sense that we can play a significant military role in the war. And it's an event that follows us as one of our laurels throughout the next 3 years. And a lot of people point back to as the first demonstration of skill, ability, but also just bloody mindedness on the battlefield, which is sometimes what you need.
The experience of the Western Front and the great battles like the Somme, Ypres, Passchendaele were bloodbaths and known for their horrific slaughter on both sides. The myth later, or the attitude to war, changed among the elites, in particular with books like Goodbye to All That and All Quiet on the Western Front, and some French novels and autobiographies out of the trenches. How did Canada's attitude, or the attitude of Canadians, and we can talk about French Canadians as well as English and Native Canadians, evolve during and after the war?
That's a very good question. I mean, we see how quickly Canada disarms and demobilizes after the war in 1919, evidently making it clear that it doesn't want or can't afford a large standing army. The military struggles for survival during the 30s. Mostly it's put on a kind of care and maintenance basis. It's clear that Canadians as a society have no appetite for overseas adventures of the kind that they just had from 1914 to 1918. There's a big boom in what we would call now anti-war literature. So there's a desire to maybe explore isolation. Let's stay away from Europe for a while and see how things go before jumping in. However, in fact, when push comes to shove in September 1939, there is no hesitation. The response is similar, perhaps even greater than it was in August 1914. There's not the enthusiasm, the excitement. No one talks about it as an opportunity, but it's now a job that has to be done. We did this once before. If we don't follow up what we did in the First War, we're betraying our history. So it's with a much more business-like attitude that Canada returns to war in 1939, because I think everyone knows what it's like. It's in everyone's memory, and it's all too painful, and they know what to expect and they know what to avoid, but they also know it's really something we have to do as a nation.
General, thank you very much for this, Jonathan. That's fantastic. And I want to come back to you on a couple of other key issues, I think. General, how important are civilian attitudes to the morale and thinking of the professional soldier? Because as you pointed out, we have a volunteer army. So it really is an expression of the nation. How do soldiers experience what Canadians in general think about the military and its uses?
I think, to share some thoughts on this in relation to our experiences on combat operations, certainly the last ones we fought in Afghanistan, we always felt very well supported. Certainly believed when we were going over there that this is something where the government and the population was behind us, which makes it easier for soldiers to do their jobs. Combat is a test of humanity, and it's a battle of wills from the individual soldier right up to the national level. And as long as at the national level, that will is there, the soldiers, your Canadian soldiers, are ready to do their jobs. And that was certainly my experience, whether on combat operations or on peace support operations. We have many, many courageous men and women who are happy to get after doing the business of helping others or fighting others. And I like to go back to what I often say to folks is that we don't fight because we hate what's in front of us. We fight because we love what's beside us or behind us. And so I've never gone into a theater where I thought that I didn't have the support of the population or the support of our government. So it makes it easier to do our job, that's for certain.
Yeah, I'm sure that is true. When you're putting your life on the line and other people's lives on the line, you want to know that you have the support of your nation and your people.
Indeed.
Gertrude, you swim in the artistic world and the intellectual world. How is the zeitgeist, the spirit of the time as regards the military, war, conflict, and the realities of the international situation?
I think I swim more in the military world. I can't handle, the other as well. I have some nice connections with the art world, but they've sort of dwindled. I think these are such tempestuous times. I know that the subject of well, as an artist, if you are, I mean, historically, that is over the last 30 years in the contemporary art world, if you're doing work that's about war, it's probably considered not really significant as contemporary art. It's considered more illustrative. So I think some huge things have to happen. If you've asked me about the contemporary world, I'm just going to put that in with the rest of society. Some big things are going to happen. Some big shifts are going to have to happen, I think, if the barometer continues the way it certainly seems. That is towards possibly requiring national service. I've sort of jumped ahead in subject matter here, but the art world, the intellectual, the academic world is so preoccupied with so much, which is about identity and rights. But in terms of responsibility, I think there's going to have to be some sort of shift where identification also includes the notion of security and the country. It'd be great if it didn't have to be this way, but unfortunately, that's the way things seem to fall in place at times.
We're living interesting times, just as we saw on Tuesday last. Things are changing. The climate is changing, weather is changing, geopolitics are changing, and technology is changing, war technology in particular. They're all changing very quickly. So we're living in a new world. You have one work which you call polycrisis, and that term is often used to refer to the multiple crises which are simultaneously shaking up the world system. Would you want to show us polycrisis for a moment and talk about it, Gertrude?
Of course. Polycrisis is based on a large portrait that I did early 2024 of General Eyre while he was still chief of the defense staff. So it's a parallel piece to the large portrait. The text, it's not as conceptual and complex as the text, I think, in most of my other works. It's pretty straightforward. It's really stealing from his sound bites. I just thought they were so apt. Security is global. I highlight certain areas like Ukraine and Gaza, obviously. And readiness for the Canadian forces, there's certainly an urgency there. So there was just in constructing the portrait, his 5 long sittings, getting that hand, which is raised on our left side of the screen with CAF, Canadian Armed Forces, underneath it. It's that, how high are we going to go? How are we going to be able to get the forces where we need them to be? So again, very straightforward text, multipolar world, very chilling. All the realignments today, I know the other 2 gentlemen can speak to this. The global shifts today and alliances and so forth.
I would like to pick up that actually and move to Jonathan quickly for a few remarks on what he thinks the attitude now of Canadians is to the world and to the military, and are we ready to face the new realities, or are we asleep at the switch? And I'm not talking about our military, I'm talking about the rest of us. Jonathan.
Yeah, I was interested in the general's comments because I certainly am glad to see that there is widespread public support for members of the military in all sorts of respects. Obviously, there's less support for political decisions that govern the military, and this has always been the case. I mean, Mackenzie King, when he was prime minister, was booed by the troops in Britain. King, to his to his great dissatisfaction, desperately wanted to be understood and accepted by the military, but he simply couldn't understand them. He just didn't understand what the military or its people were about, and he always felt that lack. And I think there is, we feel deeply that the sacrifices, the work that our individual fellow Canadians are doing, we're less sanguine about the job that our politicians are doing in making sure that our forces get to the right places with the right things. And I think the recent history has suggested to me anyways that personally we're prepared in terms of human resources. I think in terms of the kit they need, the support they need in more practical ways, we have less reason to be sanguine. The other thing I would suggest, though, is it's hard to predict what societies will do in difficult situations. And just two quick stories that come to mind from the Second World War. In the late 1930s, on university campuses around the Western world were the hotbeds of anti-war movements, peace unions, peace pledges. Student bodies were voting 60, 70, 80% in favor of peace unions. A couple of years later, the vast majority of these students were in uniform. So what you see, if you look at the history, you see that the pacifist of 1938 is the infantry officer of 1940. When push comes to shove, their orientation changes and they stand up and come forward. Another one is years ago, I was talking to a senior air marshal in the Royal Air Force who had fought through the Second World War, he and his brother. And I was taught, this was, I think, in the late 80s, early 90s. I mentioned to him that, you know, kids these days, they don't seem to have any sense of the world. They have no sense of obligation. They're lazy. They're self-absorbed. We just can't count on them like we had been able to count on them in the past. And he said, well, you know, that's exactly what they said about us in the 1930s. Kids in the 1930s, they're lazy, they're shallow, they only care for their own comfort, they're useless, we can't trust them. And yet, when they were needed and the call went out, they came out in enormous numbers. So, I mean, I think we need to be really careful about giving ourselves a progress report right now, because we simply don't know how people will react when the time comes. We do have to make sure they have the tools to react properly. And again, I think that's the area of concern more than public support for members of the military and the work they do.
So to a certain extent, there's a split between the admiration for the military and maybe a lack of admiration from time to time for our political leaders. And
this has been the case for ages. I mean, it's always, Remembrance Day is the time when you recognize the people. It's not the time when you debate whether the policy that took their lives was worthwhile. You give these people the dignity of having their participation, their sacrifice honored, and you talk about their the policies that put them there later.
That's a very good distinction. General, you are a professional. You can't comment on politics, obviously, or you have to avoid politics, but you are an expert in readiness. And in the present world, we have to be ready for all sorts of things. How are we getting ready, and how can we get ready?
Yeah, and so you're absolutely right, and we are getting ready every day. And to follow on to Professor Vance's points, pardon me, our soldiers are seized with their responsibilities, and we're tracking what's happening globally. This is something that obviously we take it all very seriously. We know that we can't waste a day of training. It's too late to start training. We've learned this in the past, and certainly we learned it on our way to Afghanistan. You can't start training on the aircraft or when you land in theater. That training has to be done and dusted before you get onto that. But it is important to note as well, like, we will fight with the army we have, not the army we want. And I think that's an important consideration as well. We are getting after readiness. We have a culture of readiness and excellence in our CAF right now. We're rebuilding ourselves in a sense post-COVID, which kind of slowed us down a little bit, and has had an impact on our recruiting. But we are rebounding. And what I would offer is that, you know, when I was in Latvia 2 weeks ago now, I saw upwards of 2,000 soldiers there. They were all motivated. They were all driven. They were all getting after the business, and quite happy to be doing their duty forward. Also here, I was in base Petawawa the last 3 days around soldiers training as well, and they're also doing that. So every day we're focused on this, and our mantra here is not having is not an excuse for not doing. We'll do the best we can with what we have where we were put, and that is indicative of, I think, Canadians across history. And of course, I would defer to Professor Vance and Ms. Kearns as well on that, but you can rest assured we are getting ready, and we will be ready when the time comes.
I would say that there's a huge difference today than the two world wars. I mean, in 1914, Canada goes from a military of 3,000 men to 500,000 over the course of a couple of years. We're virtually defenseless in 1939, but a couple of years have the largest Air Force, Navy, one of the largest navies in the world. It's different now. You can build a Sopwith Camel in 1916 in a couple of weeks. You can churn out 100,000 Ross rifles in 2 months. They're not very good, but they'll do the trick. You can't build a front-end military aircraft with all the avionics in 10 days. You can't train your people on 10 days. So at some point, we have to decide. We as a people have to decide if we're going to continue to want to have a role internationally, or if we're going to step back. And whether there's a right or wrong is irrelevant. This is a political decision that has to be made. We have to make a decision, because we can't ask our people to go out into the world improperly kitted out. If we decide we want to step back, that's fine, but we also have to understand that there'll be consequences to staying out of world issues. It may not even be possible. So these are tough decisions. And when the general talks about Canada standing behind its people, I want to make sure that the government stands behind them with more than simple platitudes. I think that's the issue for me.
That is essential. We have a few questions. One is, so we have to move now, I am told, by our time producers, to question time. Unless the general has something to say. I saw him. No, he's happy. Good. In recent years, we have seen a growing emphasis on psychology and post-trauma stress disorder and such like things. Has the psychologizing of human experience impacted the attitude towards war and the military, and particularly towards the question of military service? Who would like to take that on? Professor Vance, would you like to initiate with that?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I mean, and first of all, I'm speaking as someone who has never been in the military or experienced combat, so take this with a grain of salt. But in some ways, the psychological response to war depends on what your peacetime life is like. So in the First World War, because the workplace, because farming, because I mean it was a difficult life. The difference between what people were used to and what they were asked to do in the army was less. So there's a legendary sign that someone put on their farm that said, "You say war is hell, you should try homesteading." For a lot of guys, they'll write home and say they're actually getting 3 meals a day, which is in the army, which is great stuff for them. Fast forward to now, where we live in a society of relative comforts. We have what we need. We have what we want. We have a social safety net. We have all sorts of supports. We are, generally speaking, well cared for and live well. That's a huge gap from being in combat. And so to make that leap psychologically, not just from a relatively affluent peacetime society to a war environment, but then to make it back, that leap back, this is, I think, where a lot of the issues are. The stress of combat is so far from people's normal experience that it is difficult to negotiate. And I think that's simply going to be magnified going on.
Would you like to come in on that, or we move to the next question? General, are you?
So what I would offer is, I think it's hugely important for us to be prepared to explain to the soldiers why they're doing what they're doing. I feel as though some psychological injuries occur when the soldier has a difficult time rationalizing what it is he's doing with kind of his or her greater vision of what the mission is. And sometimes that disconnection between the act and the reason, I think certainly has been able to have more of an impact, I think, psychologically. Not to dismiss anything Professor Vance said, I would tend to agree with what he's offering as well. I guess this just goes back to ensuring that when we do engage in these missions, unlike what it was in World War I and World War II, where there was a clear existential threat, an immediate existential threat to what was going on back home, here in these operations that we've been engaged in the last 20, 30 years, where it's difficult sometimes to make that link back to the home front, I think that can have more of an impact on the psyche of some of our soldiers.
There's another question here, and that is about Remembrance Day. Does Remembrance Day really lead us to reflect on the nature of war and what we should do about the world situation and war and our military? Does it make us think, Remembrance Day, or not? Who wants to tackle that one?
If I could mention some remarkable pieces of work in the contemporary art sphere by both a Métis and an Indigenous artist from the Siksika Nation. The poet Suzanne Steele has written with a composer who did the score, Jeffrey Ryan, the most remarkable piece of music called the Afghanistan Requiem for a Generation. It's based on a Catholic musical form. It's absolutely searing. So I think the power of art, and in the case of the contemporary but World War I referenced Trench piece by Adrian Stinson, are works which absolutely, to use the phrase, can turn your bowels to water. I think art that is on a profound level is almost simulating the experience of, it can't simulate the experience of war, really, but it comes as close as possible to doing that, I think. So these are ways to commemorate and pay homage to the sacrifices that have been made.
I think that's probably a good place to end, since we've reflected on the changing attitudes to war, the reality of war, and whether Remembrance Day and art and culture in general do make us think about the big questions which we as citizens and our military as citizen soldiers have to think about. So we'll turn it now on to, I believe, our colleagues.
Thank you so much. Thank you to a wonderful panel. I'd like to extend our collective thanks to Gertrude Kearns, Brigadier-General Oberwarth, and Jonathan F. Vance, and of course to our moderator par excellence, Gilbert Reid. Thanks so much for sharing your profound insights today. Your thoughtful perspectives have certainly deepened our understanding of Canada's evolving relationship with war and with global affairs. We conclude this Remembrance Day event and hope that we all leave with a deeper understanding of the immense sacrifices made by so many and a renewed commitment to honor their legacy. Today's discussion has reminded us that while history often echoes in the present, the way we interpret, remember, and act on those echoes is in fact what shapes our future. To those who serve and continue to serve, and to the families who bear the weight of their sacrifices, we offer our most profound gratitude. Thanks to each of you for being a part of this meaningful commemoration. Let us never forget the courage, the loss, and hope that Remembrance Day symbolizes. And this concludes today's program from the Empire Club Foundation. We certainly hope that we've provided you with some food for thought. And for any history buffs, please do visit empireclubfoundation.org. It will offer you a whole new view on the history of Canada. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Gordon McIver signing off with our favorite words. See you at the Empire Club. Thank you and goodbye.